Imagine a world where everyone thinks the Middle Ages were nothing more than 1,000 years of darkness. Peasants knee-deep in mud, knights trapped in tin cans, and a church that wanted to burn every curious mind at the stake. Now imagine finding out almost all of that is wrong, because the truth is so much stranger and more fascinating than the clichés we've been fed. And if you stick with me, you'll see why the history you thought you knew is actually a carefully crafted myth designed by later generations to make themselves look smarter, cleaner, taller, and just plain better. We start with one of the most stubborn falsehoods, the so-called flat earth Middle Ages, a tale that sounds great for movie scenes of sailors peering into endless seas, terrified they'll fall off the edge. But in reality, medieval scholars were not lying awake at night worried about cosmic cliffs, because for centuries before Columbus ever sailed, educated people already knew the earth was round, thanks to ancient Greek measurements, Islamic scholarship, and the simple observation that ships disappear hull first over the horizon. In fact, if you had told a 14th century monk the earth was flat, he might have laughed at you while pointing to the globe in his library. Because these globes were more than decorations. They were symbols of knowledge and divine order. The flat earth myth, that was a 19th century invention, born when certain writers wanted to paint the medieval era as an age of ignorance, so that their own so-called enlightened times looked like a miraculous rescue from stupidity, which is why Washington Irving's romanticized biography of Columbus depicted him as a lone genius defying a chorus of flat earth fools, when the real argument of his day wasn't, is it round, but how big is it? And Columbus got that answer wrong, so wrong that without the Americas conveniently sitting in his way, his crew might have starved in the middle of the Pacific. But myths stick when they're cinematic, not when they're accurate. And so we keep imagining a world of flat earth medieval minds, forgetting that sailors, artists, and kings all embraced a round world centuries before the so-called age of discovery. The second myth we need to bury is the idea of medieval Europeans as filthy, water-fearing creatures who lived in constant clouds of stench. The popular image is peasants reeking like wet sheep, while nobles swanned around in perfume to mask the horror. Yet the real story is far more complex and honestly cleaner. Public bathhouses, often buzzing with gossip and social deals, dotted towns across Europe, and even in small villages, people used rivers, lakes, and barrels of collected rainwater to wash. Soap made from animal fat and lye might not have smelled like modern lavender artisanal bars, but it did the job. And monks had strict washing schedules because cleanliness was linked to spiritual discipline. Nobles enjoyed private baths infused with herbs like rosemary and sage. And while not everyone scrubbed head chuto daily, the notion that they avoided water entirely is a lazy caricature. Ironically, people in later centuries spooked by new medical theories about open pores, letting in bad air, often bathed less than their medieval ancestors. In other words, a 14th century baker might have been cleaner than a 17th century courtier, though the baker smelled more like bread than bergamot cologne. So if you picture the Middle Ages as a smelly, flattered believing wasteland, you've already missed how much richer, stranger, and smarter this period actually was. And that's just the beginning of the myths we're about to dismantle. Another stubborn image lodged in our cultural imagination is that medieval people were all miniature humans, barely tall enough to reach the dinner table, as if entire tournaments looked like toddler jousting on rocking horses. The reality is, archaeological evidence shows average men stood around 170 cm and women around 160 centimeters. Not MBA material, sure, but definitely tall enough to slam their head on a low doorway, which, by the way, wasn't designed for short people at all. It was built that way to trap heat in winter. So yes, people still banged their helmets on lintels, but it was because of insulation, not evolution. Diet and class played a role. Nobles ate more protein and richer food, which could give them a height advantage. But even peasants could grow tall if they had access to varied food and fewer childhood illnesses. The short medieval person trope lingers because it fits the broader cartoon of a shrunken, primitive past. But stand a healthy medieval archer next to a modern person, and you might be surprised how similar they look in stature, except perhaps with more muscle from hauling longbows all day. Then there's the idea that the Middle Ages were a 1,000-year blackout of human progress, labeled the Dark Ages as though no one did anything but till mud and debate angels on pinheads. In truth, medieval Europe saw the birth of universities, the rise of Gothic architecture, the refinement of mechanical clocks, breakthroughs in agriculture, and more intellectual debates than some modern forums. The dark branding came from later Renaissance and Enlightenment writers who wanted their own eras to seem like heroic dawns after centuries of darkness. So they exaggerated the gloom of the centuries before them. A classic marketing tactic. Make the competition look bad, so you look brilliant. It's also worth noting that medieval life wasn't as visually dark as reenactments might suggest. People had windows, oil lamps, torches, and daylight, just like we do. Though, yes, it was a far cry from the neon glow of our kitchens. Yet, in that softer, flickering light, scribes created manuscripts of mind-bending detail. Artists painted walls with vibrant colors, and engineers built cathedrals whose scale and precision still puzzle us. Now, about that so-called bland medieval diet, it's another case of selective storytelling. Yes, peasants often lived on bread pottage, and whatever vegetables or preserved fish they could get, but nobles dined on heavily spiced meats, fruit-studded stews, and elaborate presentations meant to impress think-roasted peacocks with feathers reattached for drama, pies that released live birds when cut open, and sauces mixing sweet and savory in ways that would make a modern foodie do a double-take. Even common folk added herbs, onions, ale, and seasonal produce to brighten meals, and fairs introduced them to exotic treats like almonds or candied ginger. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger were prized not only for flavor, but for status. Using them was like parking a luxury car on your dining table. When famine or siege hit, the menu could turn grim, but in times of abundance, medieval cooking could be vibrant, experimental, and full of bold flavor combinations that would hold their own on a modern table. The myth of tasteless medieval food says more about our need to feel superior than about what people actually ate. If Hollywood has taught us anything, it's that a knight in shining armor was basically a medieval turtle. Fall over and you're doomed. Stuck on your back, waiting for someone to flip you. Yet the truth is that a well-made suit of plate armor was less a prison and more a tailored exoskeleton. Weighing around 45 to 60 pounds, it was no heavier than a loaded hiking backpack. But unlike that backpack, the weight was distributed evenly across the body so knights could run, vault onto horses, and even do somersaults in training drills. The helpless knight image comes from turment armor, heavier, bulkier, and built for jousting. Not war, plus 19th century Victorian replicas made for display, not movement. Put a middle-aged reenactor in a badly fitted decorative suit, and yes, He'll look like a wind-up toy on its last turn, but a trained knight in battle gear could be terrifyingly agile. The myth of a clumsy knight survives because it's funnier than the reality of a steel-clad athlete, charging at you with the confidence that comes from knowing your armor can take a sword hit. Just as armor myths are overblown, so too is the idea that the medieval church was at war with science. While some high-profile cases, like Galileo's clash with church authorities, are real, the sweeping claim that the church hated science is simplistic and misleading. Many of the eras scientists were clergy, monasteries preserved classical texts through centuries of copying, and universities, most founded and funded by the church, taught astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. The church did expect science to fit within theological boundaries, and yes, challenging certain cosmic hierarchies could be risky. But to say science was banned ignores the reality that much of medieval Europe's scientific tradition survived because the church safeguarded it. The science-hating church narrative became popular during the Enlightenment, when writers wanted to frame their own era as a bold rebellion against superstition, conveniently forgetting the centuries of scholarly groundwork laid by religious institutions. And then there's the infamous average life expectancy was 30 inches claim, which conjures images of medieval people keeling over just as they were figuring out adulthood. But that number is an average pulled down by brutal infant mortality rates. Disease, famine, and accidents claimed many young lives. But if you survived childhood, you had a decent chance of reaching your 50s or 60s, sometimes older. The records show plenty of elderly peasants, long-reigning monarchs, and grey-haired artisans who lived long enough to complain about kids these days in Latin. Using the 30 years figure without context is like saying modern life expectancy would be 20 if we counted only people who survive a zombie apocalypse. Technically correct in math terms, but wildly misleading in human terms. The reality is that while life was harder, dangerous, and less medically secure, it was not a conveyor belt to the grave at 30, and people planned for long lives, invested in property, and passed down stories across generations because they expected to be around to see their grandchildren grow. If we believed every period drama, medieval Europe was one long pyrotechnic festival, of which burnings market day in the morning, public execution by afternoon, and tankard of ale by evening, but large scale, which burnings were far more a product of the early modern era than the medieval one. In fact, the medieval church often dismissed witchcraft accusations as superstition, and in earlier centuries even declared that believing in witches' powers could itself be heresy, a fascinating inversion where the accuser risked more than the accused. Yes, people were punished for alleged sorcery, but penalties were more likely to be fines, exile, or public humiliation rather than the bonfire treatment, partly because burning required expensive fuel and medieval towns weren't in the habit of wasting good timber on your cranky neighbor who muttered over herbs. The mass panics and how-to manuals for witch hunting, like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, didn't catch fire until the late 15th century and beyond, by which time the printing press could spread paranoia faster than rumor at a tavern. While witch burnings have become shorthand for medieval cruelty, they're really a mislabel from the wrong century, much like blaming the 1980s for TikTok. Equally misrepresented are medieval peasants, often portrayed as mud-bound serfs with no rights, no voice, and no movement. Yet manorial court records show that peasants could and did challenge fines, sue neighbors, and even take disputes to their lord, with predictable results that still favored the powerful but didn't erase the legal channels entirely. Peasants had customary rights to gather firewood, graze animals, or fish in certain waters, and would fiercely defend these privileges, sometimes with pitchforks, sometimes with sabotage under cover of night. Movement wasn't forbidden either. While many were tied to land through feudal obligations, seasonal labor, markets, and fairs drew people to nearby towns, and ambitious or desperate individuals could travel much farther, provided they could survive the journey and avoid spending all their coin at roadside ale. Then there's the idea that castles were gloomy slabs of stone looming over dreary villages, a fantasy helped along by the fact that modern ruins have lost their medieval paint jobs. In their prime, castles were often plastered, whitewashed, and painted in bold colors, reds, blues, golds, and their interiors draped with tapestries, banners, and painted furniture. The Great Hall wasn't a cold echo chamber, but a riot of heraldry, carved wood, and patterned tiles under warm firelight, designed to impress allies and intimidate rivals. Color meant wealth, order, and status, and medieval elites used it like a weapon of prestige, knowing that a vividly dressed hall could convey power before a single word was spoken. If you walked into a 14th century noble's bedchamber expecting minimalist stone walls, you might need sunglasses and perhaps an allergy pill for the rushes on the floor. When people talk about the Black Death, they often claim it wiped out half the world, a terrifying figure that makes it sound like 14th century Earth was one giant plague ward. But while the pandemic was indeed catastrophic, killing between 30% and 60% of Europe's population, it didn't touch entire continents like Africa, the Americas, or much of Oceania. And in 1347 there were places that didn't even know Europe existed, let alone that it was in the middle of a microbial apocalypse. The impact in affected areas was still unimaginable. Whole villages abandoned, labor shortages that shook feudal structures, and a psychological toll so deep that some people saw it as divine punishment, others as poisoned air, and still others as foreign merchants bring in cursed cargo, all before germ theory was a gleam in a scientist's eye. Prevention methods ranged from burning incense to carrying posies to the frankly unhelpful belief that bathing could open the pores to bad air, proving that even the cleanest habits could backfire under bad science. Yet out of the chaos came economic shifts that gave surviving peasants more bargaining power, at least until the nobility figured out ways to push back. Then there's trial by combat, another mythic fixture of medieval storytelling, where every land dispute seems to end with two armored men swinging swords until one is dead. In truth, it was a rare legal option, often heavily regulated, and in many cases replaced by oath-taking, witness testimony, or the charmingly sadistic trial by ordeal, which might involve carrying red-hot iron or being dunked in a river. When combat was allowed, it wasn't always to the death. Sometimes it ended when one party yielded or was too injured to continue, which is far less cinematic than a fatal blow in the rain. By the late Middle Ages, these duels were such an oddity that when they did occur, they drew huge crowds like a medieval Super Bowl, precisely because most disputes were settled by paperwork, not polems. And speaking of reality versus myth, medieval medicine is another subject where selective memory has created a caricature. Yes, bloodletting and leeches were common under the theory of balancing the four humors, but medicine also included herbal remedies, basic surgery, and surprisingly effective practices like using honey to treat wounds or willow bark for pain relief. Physicians, apothecaries, midwives, and barber surgeons each had their role. One could cut your hair, extract a tooth, and amputate a leg, all in one appointment. Which sounds horrifying, but also efficient in a we don't have time to wait for specialist way. Hospitals run by religious orders offered care that, while limited by modern standards, still aimed to provide cleanliness, nutrition, and comfort. Not every remedy worked. Powdered emeralds for certain ailments, or dead moles worn as amulets spring to mind. But the idea that medicine was nothing but superstition ignores the genuine knowledge they preserved and passed on, much of which bridged the gap between classical antiquity and the medical revolutions to come. If you believed most TV shows set in the Middle Ages, you'd think people spent their entire lives trudging through mud, clutching their last piece of stale bread while waiting for plague, famine, or a Viking raid to finish them off. But while life was undeniably harder, riskier, and far less cushioned by technology than ours, it was not one endless parade of suffering. People laughed, told jokes, celebrated milestones, and found joy where they could, because that's what humans have always done. Festivals could stretch for days, with dancing, feasting, music, and enough wine or ale to make even the grumpiest neighbor forget a grudge for an evening. Weddings were not polite, formal affairs, but high-energy events with bawdy songs and games that sometimes scandalized the local priest. Even peasants, whose work was exhausting, carved out time for sports like archery, wrestling, and ball games, not just as recreation but as community bonding. Seasonal rhythms meant that winters could be quieter, but that downtime was filled with storytelling, crafts, and planning for the next year. No one had Netflix, so entertainment came from each other's wit and creativity. Art and beauty weren't luxuries reserved for the elite. Embroidered clothing, carved tools, and painted household objects show that even modest homes valued aesthetic touches. Food, though limited by class, wasn't unrelenting gruel. Vegetables, breads, cheeses, meats when available, and seasonal treats all made their way into diets. It's easy for modern people to look back and see only hardship because we have the luxury of comparing the past to our own convenience. But medieval people compared their lives to the alternatives they knew, and by those standards, a good harvest, a safe home, and a lively festival could make life feel full. The myth of constant misery sticks because it satisfies a modern bias that progress is always forward and that we are automatically happier than our ancestors. But that's more about our self-image than historical truth. The real Middle Ages were a mixture of toil and joy, danger and celebration. Just like any other era, the difference is that their stories came by firelight instead of phone screens. Now let's ride far from the cobbled streets and castle walls of medieval Europe, out onto the endless Mongolian steppe where the horizon swallows the sky and a single rider in the distance can mean salvation or danger. Here, hospitality wasn't a polite nicety, it was a law of survival and a matter of spiritual honor under the eternal blue sky. In a land where days of riding could separate one camp from another and a single night without shelter might kill, turning away a traveler was unthinkable, whether they were kin, a stranger, or even a former enemy. The logic was brutally practical. Today's guest could be tomorrow's rescuer, but it was also deeply cultural, rooted in the belief that a guest was a gift sent by the spirits, a test of the host's honor. Steppe life stripped away the luxury of holding grudges, at least temporarily, so it was entirely possible for a warrior to arrive at the tent of someone whose relative he'd killed in battle, only to be welcomed with warmth, fed hot mutton broth, and offered a bed by the hearth. This wasn't naivety. It was a form of high-stakes diplomacy, a show of strength, generosity, and self-control that earned a host respect far beyond their own clan. And while Western traditions often wrapped diplomacy in parchment and seals, here it happened around a fire, with food and drink as the binding agents. Mongol hospitality had its choreography, the host greeting the guest with an open stance, taking the reins of their horse to signal care for both rider and mount, lifting the felt flap of the gare so they could enter into the warmth and smoke of the central hearth. Every movement had meaning, seating the guest in the place of honor directly opposite the door, offering weapons to be set aside or laid visibly to show peace, serving airag, fermented mare's milk in a bowl held with both hands so there could be no hidden blade. To refuse the drink was to reject the bond, and even if a visitor found the tank shocking, etiquette demanded at least a token sip. Alongside the airag came bread, curds, or meat, the order itself signaling trust and honor, bread to steady. The stomach, meat as the highest sign of respect, since slaughtering livestock was a sacrifice of wealth. In these rituals, every guest was bound, not just by the physical shelter, but by a web of mutual obligation that could turn enemies into allies, or at least pause hostilities long enough for calmer decisions. In this way, Mongol hospitality was less about warm fuzzies and more about ensuring survival, preserving reputation, and using generosity as a weapon more effective than any arrow. On the steppe, hospitality was never static. It followed the rhythm of the land, changing with the seasons just as herds and families moved to find grazing. Summer brought abundance, with mares heavy with milk and the airag bag at the gares. Entrance constantly stirred by passing hands, turning fresh milk into the lightly alcoholic, tangy drink that marked every welcome. Bowls of clotted cream, fresh curds, and yogurt joined bread from portable ovens, while meat like tender mutton or goat might appear if a guest's arrival was especially honored. This was the season when evenings stretched long and social. Gatherings spilled into music, wrestling matches, and storytelling under skies so clear they seemed to stretch into eternity. Autumn shifted the tone. It was a time of preparation when livestock were fattened and the butchering began for the long, punishing winter ahead. Guests in autumn might be treated to korkhog, a slow-cooked mutton dish made with hot stones. Sealed inside a pot, the steam bursting with the scent of fat and herbs when opened. Winter was another world entirely, a season when survival trumped showmanship, and hospitality was an act of protection as much as pride. Fresh milk was rare, replaced by salty milk tea heavy with butter for warmth, while meat, often frozen or dried, was boiled simply to conserve fuel. Visitors in winter were seated closer to the hearth, conversations softened to match the muffled stillness outside. The howl of the wind a reminder that to turn away a traveler was to condemn them. Then spring arrived, tentative and lean, the grass returning slowly, herds producing again, but supplies still stretched thin. So offerings were modest, a bowl of fresh milk, a small piece of cheese, and above all, the promise of better days. Yet regardless of the season, the core of the ritual remained unchanged. The guest was honored, fed, and seated with respect, because hospitality wasn't a seasonal luxury, it was the glue that bound the nomadic world together. In fact, the dinner table, whether laid with rich meats or humble dairy, was as much a diplomatic stage as any royal court, because a feast could seal a military alliance, settle a blood feud, or establish trade routes without a single written word. The more lavish the spread, the stronger the host's political message. We are wealthy enough to share, powerful enough to protect, and generous enough to be worth trusting. In this way, the Mongols used the table not only to feed bodies, but to feed the relationships that kept the steppe from fracturing into endless war. A lesson that any modern leader obsessed with signing paper agreements might do well to study. The steppe may have seemed like an isolated ocean of grass to outsiders, but it was in fact a crossroads where cultures, goods, and news traveled as fast as a good horse could carry them, and Mongol hospitality extended to these foreign arrivals with the same sacred rules that applied to kin or ally. Persian envoys, Chinese scholars, Silk Road merchants, and even bewildered Europeans found themselves stepping through the felt doorway of a ger, and into a world where the first thing offered wasn't a demand for credentials, but a steaming bowl of broth, a chunk of bread, and a cup of arag. Whether the taste delighted or startled them didn't matter, because to accept it was to acknowledge the bond. No payment was expected, though savvy travelers often left gifts of tea, cloth, beads, or even a song from their homeland before departure, not as a transaction, but as a gesture of respect. The language barrier was rarely a barrier at all, because the rituals spoke for themselves. The seating in the place of honor, the careful presentation of food with both hands, the unobtrusive refilling of a cup before it was empty. This choreography was as effective as any treaty signing, because by the time actual negotiations began, sometimes through interpreters, sometimes in a mix of words, gestures, and shared laughter, the foundation of trust had already been laid. And the Mongols knew the value of that foundation, because in their world, stories traveled faster than soldiers. A well-treated guest would carry tales of generosity across deserts and mountains, enhancing the host's reputation in places their armies might never reach. This was calculated kindness, not naivety. A rival who had once eaten at your fire might hesitate before drawing his bow in the future, and a foreign trader who had been treated like family would return with goods and news rather than hostility. In this way, the Mongols practiced a form of foreign policy that was part survival strategy, part spiritual duty, and part public relations campaign, all performed without paper, seal, or signature, only with bread, broth, and a shared fire. In a world where alliances could shift as fast as the weather, that kind of human diplomacy was a form of power no army could match. Once you stepped inside a Mongol ger, the warmth of the welcome didn't mean you could act however you pleased. Hospitality came with an invisible rulebook, and breaking those rules could turn a peaceful visit into an insult with long memories. The very first law began before you even crossed the threshold. Never step on the wooden doorframe, because it wasn't just carpentry. It was the symbolic barrier between the harsh, unpredictable world outside and the sacred space within. To trample it was to invite bad fortune, not just for yourself, but for the entire household. Inside, the hearth at the center wasn't merely a source of heat. It was the spiritual heart of the home, linked to the eternal blue sky, and disrespecting it by stepping over it, poking at the fire uninvited, or tossing trash into the flames was like insulting the gods themselves. Seating had its own geography. The place of honor for a guest was directly opposite the door on the north side, while men traditionally sat to the west and women to the east. Plopping yourself down in the wrong spot without being invited was not a charming display of independence. It was a breach of etiquette that could sour the mood instantly. When food or drink was offered, you took it with both hands, not because you needed extra stability, but to show your palms empty of weapons, signaling you came without threat. Refusing a drink, especially the first offering of arag, was unthinkable, And even if the sour tang shocked your taste buds, you took at least a symbolic sip. Other taboos were subtler, but just as binding. Never point your feet at the hearth. Never touch someone's head, the most sacred part of the body, and keep weapons either outside or in plain sight but untouched. These customs weren't spelled out for visitors. You were expected to observe and learn, but they served a purpose beyond politeness. They maintained the delicate balance of mutual respect that kept the guest-host bond intact. To honor them was to honor not just the family, but the ancient spirit of the steppe, a spirit that demanded reverence from everyone under its endless sky. Centuries after the thunder of Mongol hooves faded from the edges of empires, the code of hospitality that once bound warriors, traders, and wanderers still breathes in the smoke curling from gurs across the steppe. In cities like Ulaanbaatar, skyscrapers may pierce the skyline and traffic may replace the gallop. But travel a few hours beyond the pavement and you'll find the same open-handed welcome that sustained life here for generations. Many Mongol families still live nomadically, moving their herds with the seasons, setting their gers beneath skies so wide they seem to swallow the horizon. A stranger, whether on horseback, motorbike, or even bicycle, is greeted as though they might be an old friend returning, offered food, drink, and a place of honor before names are even exchanged. Airag is still poured, bread still passed, the hearth still treated as the home's sacred heart. Even those in small towns or modern homes keep the spirit alive, inviting unexpected guests for tea, biscuits, and stories, because the belief lingers that a guest is a gift from Tenja, the eternal blue sky, and to refuse them is to invite misfortune. This isn't just nostalgia for the past, it's cultural pride and practical wisdom, because the steppe can still be merciless, with sudden storms, long distances, and conditions where generosity today might mean rescue tomorrow. Tourism has brought new kinds of visitors, photographers chasing golden light, historians retracing Genghis Khan's path, backpackers testing themselves against the wilderness, and many leave with the same story they were welcomed into. A ger without warning, fed, sheltered, and never asked for payment. For the hosts, it's not charity but duty, a living link to ancestors who measured honor by how they treated the vulnerable. As long as the eternal blue sky watches over the plains, the code endures, turning strangers into friends and sometimes even former enemies into unexpected allies, proving that in a world obsessed with borders and contracts, the oldest and most powerful agreements are still sealed with nothing more than warmth, bread, and a shared cup. By the autumn of 1614, Japan looked peaceful on the surface, but beneath the calm was the slow tightening of a political noose. The Tokugawa shogunate, forged by Tokugawa Ieyasu's victory at Sekigahara in 1600, ruled from Edo with a grip that seemed unshakable. Yet one powerful rival remained, the Toyotomi clan, once supreme under the legendary Hideyoshi, now embodied in his young son, Toyotomi Hideyori. Hideyori had grown from a child spared in the wake of Sekigahara into a man with wealth, influence, and a fortress that was more than just stone and timber. Osaka Castle, the mightiest stronghold in Japan, with soaring walls, layered moats, and storehouses stocked to endure a siege. Merchants, ronin, and lords discontented with Tokugawa dominance still drifted to Osaka like moths to a flame, swelling its garrison and its symbolic power. To Ieyasu, now officially retired but still the true hand on the shogunate's tiller, the Toyotomi presence was more than a military threat. It was a political alternative, a rallying point for any who wished to see the Tokugawa undone. But he understood the art of legitimacy. Striking without a just cause risked alienating neutral daimyo. So he needed a spark, something he could frame as righteous. That spark came in the form of a temple bell cast for hygiene in Kyoto, funded by the Toyotomi, whose inscription included a Buddhist prayer ending with the phrase, Kaka Anko, may the nation be at peace. To most eyes, harmless, but Tokugawa loyalists claimed the placement of characters could be read as a curse separating Ieyasu from long life. A thin pretext that was politically thick enough to do the job. The shogunate accused Hidori of plotting. Rebellion sent warnings across the country, and daimyo, eager to prove loyalty, began mustering troops for Edo's cause. Inside Osaka, Toyotomi retainers argued. Some urged peace, others saw capitulation as slow suicide, and the influx of ronin hardened the stance toward defiance. The stage was set, the pieces in motion, and winter was coming, both in season and in war. By late November 1614, the Tokugawa army was on the move, a tidal wave of banners, ashigaru, and mounted samurai advancing toward Osaka in a display meant to overwhelm by sheer scale. Estimates placed their numbers between 150,000 and 200,000. A coalition drawn from domains loyal to Edo and commanded not only by Shogun Hitada, but by the still strategizing Ieyasu himself, who at 70 remained as dangerous as any general half his age. Osaka Castle, though, was no easy target. Hideyori's defenders numbered perhaps 90,000 to 100,000, bolstered by waves of ronin who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Among the Toyotomi commanders was Sanada Yukimura, already a legend for his cunning and ferocity, tasked with turning the castle's defenses into a wall of teeth. Osaka's fortifications were a nightmare for attackers. Triple moats, towering, stone ramparts, gates designed to funnel enemies into kill zones, and supply stores brimming with rice and preserved food to withstand months of siege. Winter itself seemed an ally to the defenders. The Tokugawa army would be exposed to the freezing winds off Osaka Bay, while the defenders could rotate fresh troops to the walls from within. Ieyasu, ever methodical, avoided a rash frontal assault, instead ordering siege lines to encircle the fortress, with earthworks, watchtowers, and artillery emplacements tightening the ring day by day. Cannons, some acquired through Portuguese trade, were brought forward to batter not only the outer defenses, but also the morale of those inside. Within the walls, Hidori worked to unify his diverse forces, and Yukimura began constructing the Sanada Maru, an outwork on the southwestern side that would soon become both a defensive marvel and a nightmare for the Tokugawa. As the moats froze at night and the breath of sentries hung in the air like ghosts, the first test of the siege was about to erupt. If Osaka Castle was the heart of Toyotomi resistance, then the Sanada Maru was its sharpened spear tip, an outwork on the castle's southwestern side. Designed and commanded by Sanada Yukimura, who understood that sometimes the best way to protect the body was to make the enemy bleed at the edges. The fortification was a masterclass in practical defense, surrounded by its own moat and linked to the main castle only by a narrow passage, forcing attackers to approach under concentrated fire. Earthen ramparts rose high, matchlock gunners lined the parapets, and hidden firing positions allowed arrows and bullets to rain down from angles the enemy couldn't predict. When the Tokugawa tested the defenses in early December, they met a storm, volleys of arquebus fire cutting down advancing troops, cannon shots from within the Sanada Maru, shattering siege works, and counterattacks led by Yukimura himself that drove assailants back into the killing zones. His men, many clad in the crimson armor that became their trademark, fought with a discipline and ferocity that turned every assault into a massacre. Morale inside Osaka soared as rumors spread that Yukimura had become invincible, his red troops a wall of fire and steel. For the Tokugawa, each failed attack wasn't just a loss of men but a blow to prestige, and the Sanada Maru became a thorn they couldn't pull. Weeks of siege failed to crack it, and the bitter winter only made the defenders' resilience more impressive. By mid-December, it was clear to Ieyasu's commanders that direct assault was wasting lives, and if Osaka was to fall, it would not be through Yukimura's gate. When repeated assaults on the Sanada Maru failed, Ieyasu adjusted his approach. If he couldn't break Osaka's walls by steel, he would erode its will to fight with stone, iron, and fear. By mid-December 1614, Tokugawa siege lines bristled with artillery, not just light swivel guns, but heavy European-style culverins acquired through Portuguese trade, hauled into raised earthworks to gain better firing angles. Their targets weren't only the gates and ramparts. They aimed deep into the heart of Osaka, smashing storehouses, barracks, and even residential quarters, making it impossible for anyone inside to feel safe. The bombardment became relentless. Day and night, the boom of cannon fire echoing across the frozen moats, followed by the splintering crack of wood, the crumble of stone, and the occasional shouts of alarm as fires broke out. This was more than physical destruction. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to deprive the defenders of rest and drain their morale. Tokugawa agents shouted or smuggled messages into the castle offering mercy to those who abandoned, Hidori sowing doubts among ronin whose loyalty was more practical than ideological. Inside, Hidori and his commanders countered with public ceremonies honoring fallen warriors, generous food distributions to keep spirits up, and visible inspections by Yukimura to reassure the garrison that leadership was still strong. But, even with such measures, the constant pounding took its toll. Civilians huddled in corners, soldiers fought exhaustion as much as the enemy. And every night, the flicker of firelight was as likely to come from a burning building as from the hearth. Ieyasu understood the truth of siegecraft. Victory often belonged not to the strongest, but to the side that could endure the misery longest. And he was betting that Tokugawa discipline and resources would outlast Osaka's pride. By late December 1614, the siege had dragged on for weeks. Osaka's walls holding, but its outer districts battered, the defenders weary from constant bombardment and sleepless nights. Ieyasu, ever the strategist, recognized that forcing a breakthrough in the dead of winter risked draining his own forces as much as the enemy's. So he shifted to a different kind of victory, one that wouldn't cost thousands more lives in a final assault but would leave Osaka crippled for the next campaign. Under flags of truce, envoys from both sides met, framing the talks as an effort to restore peace to the realm, though each side knew they were playing for position rather than harmony. For the Tokugawa, the goal was to dismantle Osaka's ability to resist in the future, and the key clause in the proposed settlement was the filling of the castle's outer moats and the dismantling of its most formidable outworks. For the Toyotomi, the priority was to preserve their stronghold and their honor while sparing the civilian population from further suffering. Debates within the castle were tense. Some saw accepting the terms as survival, others as the beginning of the end, but with supplies still decent, yet morale fraying, Hidori's advisors agreed to the treaty. The Tokugawa withdrew, but as their troops pulled back, work crews filled the moats with earth and rubble, leaving the once formidable fortress far more exposed than before. Many inside Osaka underestimated the danger, relieved simply to see the siege lifted and the enemy gone, but Ieyasu had no intention of letting the Toyotomi remain a lingering threat. The so-called peace was merely the pause between storms, the quiet in which one side sharpened its blade and the other failed to realize the ground had already been cut from under its feet. The withdrawal of Tokugawa forces in early 1615 brought a fragile, deceptive calm to Osaka. Within the castle walls, life began to resemble normality again. Markets reopened. The clang of repairs replaced the thunder of cannon fire, and for a brief moment it seemed the crisis had passed. Yet the filled moats stood as silent proof that the fortress had been disarmed in slow motion. Hideyori's retainers were divided. Some argued that the truce had saved the city from destruction. Others whispered that agreeing to dismantle the defenses had been a fatal misstep that all but invited the enemy back. Still, preparations resumed. Weapons were repaired, new ronin recruited, and Sanada Yukimura once more set about reinforcing what could still be fortified. Knowing that without the moats, the battle ahead would be fought much closer to the walls and in far bloodier fashion. Outside Osaka, Ieyasu's agents kept close watch, intercepting letters, noting every arrival of warriors, and spinning rumors that the Toyotomi were already plotting rebellion, giving Edo the political cover it needed to strike again. By spring, the atmosphere was tense enough to snap. Hideyori's camp debated whether to send hostages to Edo in a final bid for peace or to embrace the inevitability of war. The voices for resistance prevailed, driven by the belief that the Tokugawa would never rest until the Toyotomi name was erased entirely. When the first warm days of summer arrived, the Tokugawa armies began to mobilize once more, this time with no intention of stopping until Osaka Castle was ash and history. The so-called peace had been nothing more than the interlude between acts in a tragedy everyone now sensed was nearing its final, bloody scene. By May 1615, the second act of the siege of Osaka opened with the Tokugawa army marching once more, this time under the warm skies of the campaigning season and with the full intention of ending the Toyotomi threat forever. Over 150,000 troops poured toward the city, a mix of samurai, ashigaru, arquebusiers, and allied domain contingents whose banners created a moving forest of colors and crests, led by Shogun Hitada with the ever-present shadow of Ieyasu overseeing every move. Osaka's defenders, numbering around 55,000, were outmatched but far from cowed. Hideyori had again called inveterate ronin, men hardened by years of wandering after Sekigahara, their loyalty forged less by politics than by the promise of an honorable last stand. Sanada Yukimura, now even more aware of the vulnerabilities left by the winter's truce, pushed for aggressive tactics, meeting the Tokugawa in the field before they could completely encircle the city. The first major clash erupted at Domuji, where Toyotomi forces under Goto Matabai tried to halt the Tokugawa advance. Matabe's troops fought fiercely, but poor coordination and the sheer weight of enemy numbers forced them into retreat, with Matabai himself killed in the chaos, a loss that sent a chill through Osaka's defenders. Meanwhile, at Yao and Weka, Yukimura led hit-and-run attacks, using his knowledge of the terrain to harass the advancing enemy, his red-armored troops striking like lightning before melting back into safer ground. Yet despite these spirited engagements, the imbalance of manpower was inescapable. Every skirmish cost the Toyotomi men they couldn't replace, while the Tokugawa lines closed in, their artillery creeping ever closer to the now exposed walls. By mid-June, Siege works and cannon positions were pressing against Osaka like a tightening fist, and the defenders knew the next phase would be the most brutal yet. By late June 1615, the summer heat hung heavy over Osaka, and the Tokugawa grip had tightened to the point where every street within the walls felt the pressure. Cannon fire shook the air day and night, and the defenders were being pushed into a smaller and smaller space, their sorties growing more desperate as supplies and safe ground dwindled. Sanada Yukimura, the unshakable soul of Toyotomi resistance, knew the siege was entering its final act and refused to wait passively for the enemy to breach the gates. On June 4th, he led a bold counterattack at Tennoji, south of the castle, hoping to smash through the Tokugawa lines before their encirclement could fully choke Osaka. His red-armored troops surged forward in a wave, spears lowered, arquebuses firing in disciplined volleys, and for a brief, electrifying moment, the Tokugawa front wavered, their formations bending under the force of the charge. Eyewitnesses later claimed Yukimura fought like a man possessed, striking down opponents with his spear, rallying his men with shouts that cut through the roar of battle. But the sheer weight of Tokugawa numbers began to tell. Reserves poured in, and the gap Yukimura had opened closed like a wound. Wounded in the chaos and knowing the field was lost, Yukimura reportedly urged his men to fight on without him, his final act not one of retreat but of defiance. With their greatest commander fallen, Toyotomi morale collapsed, and the Tokugawa pressed the advantage, smashing through the weakened gates and flooding into the castle grounds. Fighting raged in courtyards and corridors, steel flashing in air, until Hidari and his mother, Yodogemi, unwilling to be taken alive, committed seppuku as flames consumed the keep. By evening, Osaka Castle was a ruin, the Toyotomi clan erased as a political force, and the age of the Great Sengoku Wars truly ended under Tokugawa rule, a victory paid for in tens of thousands of lives and sealed in ash and silence. Around 1260, when the Mongol Empire still stretched across much of the known world like an unbroken sea of horsemen and banners, a girl named Kutulun was born into one of its most powerful bloodlines, the direct descendant of Genghis Khan. Through her father, Kaidu, ruler of the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, her childhood was not the sheltered life of a courtly princess, but a training ground for survival in a land where a person's worth was measured in skill, stamina, and the respect they commanded. She learned to ride almost before she could walk, her small hands gripping the reins as she moved with the horse as naturally as breathing. She practiced archery at full gallop, wrestling with siblings until the dust clung to her braids, and reading the moods of weather, animals, and people with the same attentiveness, because on the steppe, failing to read any of them could mean death. Her father's world was a constant chess match of alliances and wars, locked in a bitter rivalry with his cousin Kublai Khan, the ruler of the Yuan dynasty in China. Armies and political emissaries flowed in and out of Kaidu's camps, and Kutulun grew up surrounded by the clang of weapons, the smoke of campfires, and the quiet intensity of strategy meetings. Unlike many noble daughters who were groomed for arranged marriages to secure alliances, Kutulun trained alongside warriors, her potential too obvious to be confined to the domestic sphere. By her teenage years, she was already riding with her father's forces on campaigns, not as a ceremonial figurehead but as a fighter, learning the fluid, deceptive maneuvers of Mongol cavalry warfare and proving she could hold her own against seasoned warriors. Every battle hardened her reputation, not just as Kaidu's daughter but as a leader in her own right. and the white horse she favored on the battlefield became a symbol feared by enemies and admired by allies. In a society that valued results over rhetoric, she was becoming a rare figure, a woman whose skill at arms and loyalty to her people commanded respect in the same measure as any man's. As Kutulun's fame spread across the steppe, it wasn't only her prowess in battle that drew attention, but a bold, personal declaration that would turn her into a legend. She announced that she would only marry the man who could defeat her. In wrestling, the most physically demanding and honor-bound sport of Mongol culture, this wasn't a playful jest tossed out at a feast. It was a formal challenge delivered with the confidence of someone who had already beaten countless men in friendly bouts and battlefield tests of strength. Mongol wrestling was no dainty sport. There were no weight divisions, no soft mats, no concessions to size or age. It was raw strength, cunning, footwork, and the ability to control your opponent's center of gravity until they hit the ground with both shoulders. To raise the stakes and filter out half-hearted challengers, Kutulun required that any man who lost forfeit 100 horses, a wager so steep that only the wealthiest or most confident would dare step forward. Match after match, she threw men to the dust, often before the crowd had even finished cheering the start. Her technique, clean and ruthless, using leverage and speed to dismantle opponents who underestimated her. The horses began to accumulate until she possessed a herd, numbering in the thousands, a living, breathing fortune and an unmistakable symbol of her dominance. Each defeated suitor left not only lighter in livestock, but lighter in pride, his humiliation carried in stories that spread as far as Persia and the Mediterranean. Yet this wasn't about greed. Kutulun's challenge was a political shield as much as a personal statement, a way to control her own fate in a world where noble marriages were strategic deals between men. No father, Khan, or council could force her into a union that hadn't been earned in the circle, and the very conditions she set meant that no man, however strong, had yet managed to claim the prize. With every victory, her legend grew. She was not a prize to be won, but a test to be survived, and no one had passed. Kutulun's dominance in the wrestling ring was only part of her power. Her true legend was forged on the battlefield, where strength, speed, and precision could decide the fate of armies. Riding alongside her father, Kaidu, she became known for a signature move that even seasoned Mongol warriors found astonishing. In the chaos of mounted combat, she could seize an enemy rider from horseback, wrench him from his saddle in one fluid motion, and drag him back through the melee to her own lines, alive and utterly humiliated. This was no circus trick. It demanded perfect timing, an unbreakable grip, and the nerve to plunge deep into the enemy's formation where every spear and arrow seemed aimed at her. Her white horse, now famous as her constant companion, became a phantom on the battlefield, one moment a distant blur, the next a sudden, lethal presence tearing through enemy ranks. Kaidu relied on her not only as a shock fighter, but as a commander, entrusting her with flanking maneuvers, scouting missions, and the defense of key positions. Under her leadership, troops fought harder, their morale lifted by the sight of a commander who could match them in stamina and surpass them in skill. Her enemies, meanwhile, painted her as dangerously unconventional, a woman who disrupted the expected order of politics and war alike. But Kutulun's approach was rooted in the core Mongol principle of results over rhetoric. She wasn't fighting to fit into anyone's notion of what a noble woman should be. She was fighting to win, and her victories made her a living embodiment of her father's authority. On the steppe, where survival meant adapting faster than your opponent, She proved that mastery in sport and mastery in war were two sides of the same coin, and she had both in abundance. Kutulun was more than a warrior riding under her father's banner. She was Kaidu's closest lieutenant in his long and bitter struggle against his cousin Kublai Khan, a rivalry that was as much about the soul of the Mongol Empire as it was about territory. Kublai, ruling from the grandeur of the Yuan court in China, embraced the trappings of a settled imperial system, while Kaidu clung to the nomadic traditions of Genghis Khan's era, valuing mobility, clan loyalty, and the freedoms of the open steppe. Kutulun's presence at her father's side was both symbolic and practical. She wasn't just there to inspire troops. She was part of the decision-making core, sitting in on war councils, assessing intelligence, and commanding forces. In the field, her very existence as a high-ranking female commander unsettled some of Kaidu's male allies, yet she proved again and again that her loyalty and competence outweighed their discomfort. Marriage, politics, a critical tool in Mongol diplomacy, could have made her a bargaining chip in Kaidu's strategy, but her wrestling challenge and refusal to wed without defeat kept her out of the marriage market and out of her enemy's hands. This was not simply personal stubbornness. It was a calculated shield for her father's cause, preventing rivals from using her as a pawn to fracture Kaidu's power. In this way, Kutulun's independence became a political weapon, denying her father's opponents one of the most common avenues of influence in the steppe world. Her bond with Kaidu was not the sentimental closeness of father and daughter in peacetime, but the trust of two leaders who had fought, bled, and strategized together in a war that spanned years. And for Kaidu, whose legitimacy rested on proving that the old Mongol ways could still stand against the wealth and scale of Kublai's empire. Having a daughter who embodied those values on and off the battlefield was as much a declaration as any victory. In 1301, the balance of Kutulun's world shifted forever when her father, Kaidu Khan, the unyielding rival of Kublai and the anchor of her political and military life, died after decades of war. His death left more than a personal void. It tore open a dangerous power vacuum in the Chagatai Khanate, where loyalty was often as temporary as the wind's direction. There were whispers that Kaidu had considered Kutulun as a potential successor, not as a ceremonial figurehead, but as a leader in truth, because she had commanded men, made decisions in council, and proven herself on the battlefield in ways few of his sons had. But the political culture of the Mongol elite, though pragmatic in war, was still dominated by male leadership, and her candidacy, if it ever had a real chance, was buried under the ambitions of her male relatives. Rival claimants emerged, quickly forming fragile alliances and breaking them just as fast, each maneuvering for control of the Khanate's armies, tribute routes, and symbolic authority. Kutulun still held immense influence, commanding her own loyal warriors and controlling a fortune in horses that could sustain military campaigns. But she also became the target of political whisper campaigns, some accusing her of overstepping the bounds of a woman's role, others suggesting she wielded too much sway over Kaidu's decisions when he lived. She played the dangerous game of steppe politics with skill, supporting or opposing claimants as it suited her goals, always working to preserve her father's legacy and protect her people's autonomy. But the political tide was against her. Eventually, a male relative, Dua Khan, consolidated power, and while Kutulun retained her independence and her military command, the dream of her openly leading the Khanate faded into the realm of what might have been. Even so, she refused to fade quietly into the background, continuing to ride at the head of her own forces and to remind the new rulers, and the steppe itself, that Kaidu's daughter was still a force to be reckoned with. In the years after Kaidu's death, Kutulun never became Khan, but she never became irrelevant either. Her wealth in horses, her personal guard of loyal warriors, and her unmatched reputation ensured that no ruler of the Chagatai Khanate could afford to ignore her. She rode in campaigns when needed, settled disputes among allies, and maintained a degree of autonomy that was rare for any Mongol noble, especially a woman. Yet power in the steppe was a double-edged sword, and with influence came rumor. Stories circulated that she had finally married, perhaps for political reasons, though no chronicler could confirm the match. Others whispered darker tales spun by rivals, accusing her of secret lovers or even treachery, not because there was proof, but because on the steppe a rumor could cut as deeply as a blade. The Mongol world itself was shifting. The unity forged by Genghis had long fractured, and the Chagatai Khanate faced both internal rivalries and external threats. Kutulun adapted, lending her strength where it preserved her standing and protected her people, always careful to avoid being trapped in someone else's design. Her death around 1306 remains a mystery. Some accounts claim illness, others hint at assassination. The quiet removal of a woman who had become too politically dangerous to live. Whatever the truth, her story did not fade with her passing. Marco Polo, who had heard of her during his travels, carried tales of the undefeated wrestler princess back to Europe, where her image began to mix with myth. Over the centuries, her life inspired plays, poems, and even Puccini's opera, Turandot. Though in fictional retellings, her wrestling challenge became riddles. Her Mongol heritage was exoticized, and much of her reality was replaced with fantasy. But modern historians and Mongol oral tradition keep the core intact. Kutulun as a fierce warrior, loyal daughter, undefeated champion, and a woman who refused to be used as a pawn in marriage or politics. She proved that strength could cross the boundaries of gender, and that on the steppe, the respect you commanded came from what you could do, not who the world thought you should be. Her legend still rides with the wind over the Mongolian plains, a reminder that freedom is worth more than any crown. From the cobbled streets of medieval Europe to the windswept Mongolian steppe, from the walls of Osaka to the wrestling circles where a princess made kings look like novices, history's most persistent myths have a way of surviving not because they are true, but because they are easy to tell. We like our past painted in simple colors, a Middle Ages that was dark, dirty, and backward, Mongols as either ruthless conquerors or quaint nomads, samurai wars as simple morality plays of honor and betrayal, because complexity takes work, and nuance doesn't fit neatly into the stories we've been told 100 times before. But when you dig deeper, the picture changes. Medieval Europeans bathed more than we think, knew the earth was round, and built cities of color and ingenuity. Mongol hospitality was less about sentiment than survival and politics, yet it forged bonds that no treaty could match. Osaka's fall was not the collapse of a hopeless cause, but the calculated dismantling of a rival by one of history's most patient strategists. And Kutulun's life was proof that in a world of hard limits, there are always people willing to push through them with skill, will, and a refusal to be defined by someone else's rules. History isn't just facts on a page, it's the choices people made when the stakes were life, death, and legacy. And those choices are almost always more complicated, more human, and more fascinating than the myths that replace them. If there's one lesson to take from all of this, it's that the truth is rarely tidy, but it's always worth chasing, because every time we peel away a myth, we find something even more extraordinary hiding underneath and in understanding the past in all its messy detail. We understand ourselves just a little better.